So our story starts with the discovery of the New World. And with that discovery came a lot of things to the Old World which had never been seen before. In particular, the humble potato. Now, the potato, like for those who don't know, is incredibly nutritious. It can be grown on any kind of soil, anywhere pretty much, and it can pretty much feed an entire family. So whereas corn or wheat, etc., like needs quite a lot of land to support a small family, actually with this, like you can have a very small amount of land and it can feed many, many people. So people all across Europe were heavily dependent on potato, and nowhere more so were they dependent than amongst the Irish Catholics, during this time. And this is partly as a result of the so-called Protestant ascendancy. So this is a time in which the Protestants ruled pretty much all of Ireland, and so they kicked the Catholic peasants off of the best land and reserved for themselves, meaning that the Irish peasants had to rely on living out their existence on very small plots of land, between about 2 acres and 6 acres. Now, I'm not a farmer, so I don't know how much an acre is. I don't know what that looks like, but I'm told that it's not a lot of land to actually live on. And to have that small amount of land, you couldn't grow crops such as wheat or corn, etc., because it simply wouldn't sustain your family. So the only reliable thing that would do it was the potato. And in Ireland in particular, there was one strain of potato called the Irish lumper, which was incredibly popular. However, it obviously meant that people were far, far too dependent. So if anything was to happen to this potato crop, it would be devastating for the whole island, and that's exactly what ended up happening. So in 1845, the potato blight ended up affecting all the potatoes, not just in America, but also it spread to Europe, and many, many people across the continent end up dying. So on the continent of Europe, 100,000 people end up dying as a result of this potato blight, in particular in Prussia, in Belgium, and also to a lesser extent in France. However, there was 100,000 people that died throughout the whole of the continental Europe, but in Ireland, 1 million people end up starving to death as a result of this blight. And that's because of not just, well, the over-reliance on this one crop, but also as a result of deliberate British policies. Because at that time, Britain controlled Ireland. So you had the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland was actually subservient to England, right? So during this time in 1845, there was a lot of political instability within Britain itself. We don't have time to go into the details of this now, but it was to do with the arguments around protectionism versus free trade. So the Prime Minister, Robert Peel, he ended up resigning, and then he was taken over by someone from a different party, and this was John Russell. So whereas Peel had belonged to the Conservative Party, Russell belonged to the Whig Party. So the Whig Party was essentially a liberal party. And they were really strong believers of laissez-faire economics. So what this means is that, the government does not interfere with the market, and therefore anything that happens, you just let it go, right? Which meant that all of the policies which the Tory government had tried to do to try and support people, in particular, kind of in Ireland during this blight, they completely reversed this. The Whig Party completely reversed this and actually withdrew all of the support, which meant that many people end up starving. And also this was as a result of a direct policy by Charles Trevelyan, who basically had the view which was tied up with Malthusianism, right? Which we've covered in a previous video as well, which is, what if Thomas Malthus was correct? So definitely go and check that video out. But the predominant ideology at that time was basically that populations would grow at an unsustainable rate, and then there would be a disaster, like some sort of disease, and then it would correct itself, just like rabbits. And so it was felt that the Irish were breeding like rabbits, and so this was God's, basically just punishment, for them, so no support was given as a result of that. So during this time, during this one decade, up to 20% of the population of Ireland end up emigrating. So you have 1 million people who end up dying as a direct result of the famine, and then 2.1 million end up emigrating. So this represents about 38% of Ireland's population from 1841. So of course, that many people dying, that many people emigrating is going to have a huge ripple effect throughout the whole of history, right? So that's what this video is going to look at. And of course, we have to say the massive caveat, which is this would never happen. So the reason why it would never happen is to do with anti-Catholic bigotry, anti-Irish bigotry, and also just the politics of the time. whereas people like who were Protestant in Scotland end up getting support, people across the whole of the continent end up being supported by their governments. The British in those days did not care about the Irish, and therefore they were quite happy to let them all starve. So you'd have to have a complete change of attitudes, a complete change of government policy, etc., for this to actually happen. But let's, for argument's sake, say that it did. What would be the effect on Ireland? What would be the effect on the UK? And what would be the effect on the wider world? That's what we're going to explore now. Now, starting off with what the effect would have been on Ireland. By 1890, it's estimated that about 40% of all Irish people who were alive at that time were living abroad, right? Which shows just how huge the emigration was. Because what ended up happening as a result of the famine is obviously many people end up fleeing, like to get like jobs and food elsewhere. But also it led to a knock-on effect, which was that there would be evictions, right? So people were only allowed to be given support if they didn't own any land. And so many people had to give up the tiny amount of land that they did have in order to have some relief, right? So obviously you've got landless peasants. They then get evicted off of their land by the Protestant landlords, right? And they decided instead that they were going to use the land for cattle raising because it would be more profitable than having a bunch of these peasants there. So this led to a huge depopulation of many regions of Ireland, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But just to give you an idea of it, by 1841, you had 8.5 million Irish people living on the island of Ireland. However, by 1921, there was just 4.25 million. And even today, in 2022, there are only 7 million people living in the island of Ireland. So it gives you an idea of just how huge the depopulation was. And actually, when you look at this graph here in comparison to what it was like, what the situation was for the rest of the continent, Ireland is still one of the only countries, which has a smaller population today than it did almost 180 years ago. And actually, it won't be corrected again until about 2040. So almost 200 years after the famine, that's how long it's going to take for the population to reach what it was back then. So, of course, this has a huge, huge impact on Ireland. And of course, it led to even more bitterness towards the English, because it was seen as this was a deliberate policy to punish the Irish and to make them subservient. And of course, this ended up leading to the Home Rule movement and eventually to independence 80 years later. So if this hadn't happened, if the British government had handled this in a better way, eventually at some point there would have been some kind of calls for Home Rule, but it wouldn't have been nearly as strong as it ended up being. And the calls for independence also wouldn't have been anywhere near as strong. It would have been much, much more delayed. And even today, many Irish people still have a lot of animosity towards England, as a result of these deliberate policies, and they call it a genocide. So that kind of covers what the effects on Ireland were as such. And now we're going to talk about what effects it had on the UK.